joining us today on Lattes with Leaders.
I'm Zainab.
And I'm Trisha. And we're excited for you to join us as we catch up over coffee with CEOs and executives from diverse backgrounds and industries.
We seek to discover what is unique about each leader and educate you guys on new and interesting topics. Our conversations seek to enlighten and inspire people from around the world to realize that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things.
It's not necessarily the tools or the techniques that you use, it's who you are in using those tools and techniques. So any investment in your personal growth and development is going to pay off in such a big way for everybody's life that you touch around you and the way of being, particularly your way of being in the workplace.
In this episode, we speak with Dr. Suzy Green, a globally renowned leader in the research and application of positive psychology and coaching psychology. She's also founded the Positivity Institute, an organization dedicated to the research and application of positive psychology for life, school, and work. Suzy has worked with several organizations to implement the principles of positive psychology within a work context, and we're excited to share some tips and advice on how you could do the same. Stay tuned. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Suzy. I'm so excited to speak with you. You've done a lot of research in the fields of positive psychology and coaching psychology, and I'm really excited to dive into that and what it all means and how we can apply it at the workplace. To start off with, some of our listeners might be new to the concept of positive psychology. In your words, how would you describe positive psychology? What are the key principles and frameworks that underpin positive psychology?
Yeah, well, it is formally defined as the science of optimal human functioning, which I absolutely love. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the science of well-being or well-being science, and it certainly is. But I like that broader conception or definition of optimal human functioning. And who doesn't want to function as well as they can, in the time that we're here on the planet? So there's around 10 different positive emotions, and Barb Fredrickson's research has shown that when people experience these emotions, it broadens and builds. So it broadens their thinking. So there's been some visual eye tracking experiments that have been done that actually show that you're looking more broadly in the environment. You're looking up, actually, compared to when they induce people into more of a negative mood state, if you like, and that seems to trigger people into that fight, flight, freeze particularly when you're experiencing fear or anger. So we're sort of looking to address what's happening in the here and now, and that's really important for our survival. But Barb also says that positive emotions are equally important for our survival, and they build enduring resources. So when we experience positive emotions, we're more likely to see the similarities between ourselves. And some great research done on people from very diverse racial backgrounds. And when you induce people from these different backgrounds into a positive mood state and you bring them together, they're more likely to see the similarities rather than the differences. And that just has enormous implications for our world. And so we're building these enduring resources, particularly through our positive relationships. And it also buffers, these positive emotions buffer us against the stresses of daily life, which is why we need to create as much joy as we possibly can in our day-to-day lives, because life gives us enough struggles and suffering, Tricia, doesn't it? And of course, look, there are many other theories. There's a number of well-being theories, and perhaps we'll get into those today.
Yeah, and as you were talking about the stresses of life, I was just also reflecting on how common of a theme it is in today's media. Even just recently I was reading a report that suggested that 60% of people that was surveyed were feeling emotionally detached while at work, and almost 20% consistently feeling miserable. And, work is so much of your life. You spend almost the same amount of time, if not more time, working than sleeping.
That's right, a third of our lives, they say, yes.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that why would you want to feel miserable at work? Like why like it's not an ideal situation. And like what is some advice that you would give to someone who is experiencing stress at the workplace and how they can think through some of these concepts of positive psychology in the context of their day-to-day environment and how they can improve their stress levels?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to step back and take a bigger picture. And I know you have a global audience, Tricia. So if this is going to potentially vary from country to country or even state to state, but here in Australia, and particularly in the state that I live in, New South Wales, there's been some recent legislation around psychological health and safety in the workplace. And it's a very hot topic here in Australia at the moment. And what that is looking at is the role of the organisation, the systems, the structures, the policies, the procedures that impact on people's mental health and well-being. Now, my background is a clinical psychologist, so I spent the early part of my career working with people that were clinically suffering with disorders like depression and anxiety, and I actually treated a lot of people that were off on workers' compensation, because of a toxic work environment or some incident that had happened in the workplace. Now, today I'm here to talk about, and I absolutely believe that we can and we should be equipping people with psychological capabilities, a psychological literacy or a wellbeing literacy. But I think it's really important upfront to acknowledge that as much as I know that we can and equip people with these skills, that even sending someone back to a workplace that's actively undermining well-being or resilience, you're still not going to flourish. But in saying that, we need flourishing people to change systems. So it's not either or. We wouldn't wait until the system's better before we equipped ourselves. And as I said, I think there's a large argument for equipping ourselves and aiming to flourish as much as we can so we can go in and actively and energetically change some of these toxic work environments. But there is a recognition that there's a shared responsibility for mental health and well-being in the workplace between the individual, so there's a personal responsibility, and the organisation, and there's an organisational responsibility. And I think that's a really important topic that we need to continue to have a conversation around right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it comes from the leadership, right? And which is what you're suggesting, right? As a leader, it's your responsibility to create a certain culture and to make sure that people are thriving in that culture such that your organization can also thrive because the people are thriving.
Absolutely. And you'd know that research by Gallup and the wonderful book, I will give a plug for Gallup, It's the Manager, and lots of research to show that, people don't leave organisations, they leave leaders or managers. So the leader has a crucial role in affecting people's mental health and well-being. They can certainly, as we said, cause a lot of stress and struggle, but they can also, on the flip side, create wonderful, positive workplace culture for people to come to.
So let's say a leader is in our audience and is in a position of influence where they can shape the culture of the organization, the way that people work together. What are some pieces of advice you would give them to start off with in terms of how they should be thinking about what underpins their culture?
Yeah, well, I think there's so many things I could say there, Tricia. I think it's important to think about their own why. What is their intention? I mean, is it more than just a job for them? And how much influence can they potentially have? I mean, every interaction we have, short, even if it's a short interaction or a large, has the capacity to energize people or de-energize people. And I think for leaders, that is often quite enlightening when they realize that. And there's some great research out of the University of Michigan Center for Positive Workplaces on positive energizers and positive leadership as well. But I do think a large part is being mindful of your own well-being as a leader. We use a model which was created by my colleague, Associate Professor Aaron Jardine from the University of Melbourne Centre for Wellbeing Science. And it's a very simple one, Tricia. It's called me, we and us when we look at the workplace. So what can I do for myself when we look at, particularly when we look at the science of positive psychology, what's in it for me at the individual level, not just in the workplace, but my life, more broadly, my personal life, myself as a human being. We is myself as a leader and my team. How can we use the science there to improve both well-being and performance? And then us is across, it might be a department or across the broader organisation. So I always think, and I come back to, I guess, a coaching approach. And as you know, most great leaders are great coaches. And when we talk about coaching, there are three key components. One is you need to have the skills to be a coach, and there's a range of those skills, but the most important ones are what we call the micro skills of, basic active listening and clarifying and, building that rapport with somebody. Then there's a process. So we need to be really clear on what we're trying to do. And in the coaching world, most people will be familiar with the good old GROW coaching model. But the third and the largest piece of being a great coach, and I would argue a great leader, is what's referred to as the way of being. And it was Carl Rogers, who was a famous humanistic psychologist back in the 50s and 60s, who spoke about the importance of this from a therapeutic approach as a clinician. But we now know, and there's some research on this as well, it's not necessarily the tools or the techniques that you use, it's who you are in using those tools and techniques. So any investment in your personal growth and development is going to pay off in such a big way for everybody's life that you touch around you, and the way of being, particularly your way of being in the workplace.
Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of the coaching mindset and the coaching approach when it comes to leadership. In fact, even today when I was in a meeting and there was a lot of tension as to what to do and lots of different opinions. One of the senior leaders just stepped in and said, "Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but here is how you can think through it." And he started going into that whole coaching mindset, and it was just the whole tone of the room changed, and there was a very forward-looking approach, and people were energized by it. You could see that. And so I appreciate that link between the coaching aspect as well as the positive psychology and the outcomes that it's trying to influence.
I think it comes down to positive communication. And in fact, if we look at the model of positive leadership by Professor Kim Cameron, who's the world leading academic in this space, again out of University of Michigan, he's got 4 key components to positive leadership. The first one is positive communication. So for me, that's having the basic skills of, coaching skills. Quality conversations is what we'd refer to them. And it's not just for leaders. I mean, ideally, everybody in an organization should have access to some education and training on how to have quality conversations with people. And then, of course, the quality of our conversation affects the quality of our relationship. And so then the second part of the POS leadership model is positive relationships. And that also fits with some beautiful research, again, out of the University of Michigan by Professor Jane Dutton on high quality connections, or HQCs. And her research shows that, again, these very brief interactions we can have with people, if we're really fully present with that person, we validate what they're saying, even if we don't necessarily agree with it, and definitely before we offer our own perspective. And in fact, that example you gave before of that leader, it sounds like that's what they did. They actually stopped, perhaps potentially validated, named what was going on in the space, and then perhaps used some solution-focused approaches to try and energize people to move towards the direction that everyone wanted to move towards. And then, finally coming back, there's positive communication, positive relationships, which creates positive culture as well, and then positive meaning. And of course, the whole area of meaning and purpose is becoming very important, particularly to our younger generation in the workplace right now.
Yes, and that's actually a very important concept that I'd love to go back to. But
Sure.
just on the topic of coaching,
Yes.
so I'm very curious how you embed this into the DNA of how you operate as a company, and how you actually get people to practice this coaching mindset and approach with each other. How have you seen this play out in some organizations that you've worked with, or any examples that you've seen in other companies that you think has worked very well and that we can learn from?
Yes, look, to be honest, I have seen some exemplars, I guess, of organisations that have really been dedicated to create a coaching culture. But more often than not, I see what I would describe as a hodgepodge, or a scattergun approach to coaching. So it's not really done that. There's no real coaching strategy, I would say. So I would love to see it done better in organisations, Trisha. But for me, it's not a small undertaking by any means, because I think there is a component of education, because again, people don't know. A lot of people are naturals, as you would know. They're natural coaches. And in fact, in a lot of the training I've done over the years, sometimes you get people sort of looking at you going, do we really need to teach this stuff? And you have to say yes, because for some people it's not natural, at all. And so I think there's education, and ideally, like if I give an example, you may or may not know, a small part of our solutions or our offerings are in schools. So I've been involved in the field of positive education since it launched about 12 or 13 years ago now. And so we get the opportunity, I guess, to work with whole schools, as organisations. So you're working with 150, 200 members of staff sometimes. And so we do a whole day with all the staff on evidence-based coaching and how to have quality conversations. So we're not trying to turn them into professional coaches. They may not be in leadership positions, but it's really, again, about teaching them to have these quality conversations, to build high quality connections, to build positive relationships. But then, so you'd ideally want all staff to have some education in that. Then you'd want leader as coach. And as you would know, it's been around for a very long time in a lot of the big corporates. Most leaders have access to leader as coach training or manager as coach training. So we definitely need all leaders being equipped, because, as I said, it's a primary approach to leadership. And I would say great leaders, as I said, are great coaches. Then we want to look at, when do we bring in external coaches, and what sort of requirements do we have? Like, do we have requirements around basic level education? What are the backgrounds? Have they got accreditations? And globally, I am seeing this becoming a lot more sophisticated with the large corporates, where they really do know their stuff now around coaching, and they're very clear about who they have on their panels or who they engage from an external perspective. Then you'd also want to try and create some potentially peer-to-peer coaching conversations, so that you're not necessarily needed or needing to invest to bring in an external coach, but there can be great gains coming from a regular peer coaching conversation. And I've done this myself with peers over the years, and it's incredible how much more you get done when you've got someone that's holding you accountable and cheering you on. So you're really trying to, and there's probably more that I haven't spoken to, but you're really trying to, it needs to be the way that we, as cultures are described, the way that we do things around here. So everybody's using these quality conversational skills, and then we have very clear around when we have formal coaching and when there's, I guess, more informal coaching opportunities.
Right. Like, there's the education piece, and that's, of course, very important. But then there's also the practicing, and of course, the leaders have to start as role models, as the examples, and then hopefully that infiltrates throughout the organization, and everyone just sort of, like, that just spreads and becomes the way that people engage with each other and they communicate with each other.
Yeah, and look, I have seen organisations that are very serious about that bring in external supervisors. So I myself have come in to supervise. They create some internal coaching champions. So you ideally trying to find people internally that are intrinsically motivated. They love coaching and they can't get enough of it. And then they bring someone in like myself that would supervise those internal coaching champions to build up their internal capability as well.
That makes sense. So, okay, I want to go back to what you were saying before about, the 4 facets of, positive communication, positive relationships, positive culture, and then the meaning aspect.
Yes.
And the meaning is becoming more and more important, as you mentioned before, especially for the younger generations that are entering the workforce. And I guess there's one exercise where, leaders will go through defining, like, here's what our 5 to 10-year strategy looks like. Here's what we're really trying to achieve from a business perspective.
Yes.
But I guess when you're talking about meaning, you mean something beyond that, right? You mean something a bit more philosophical. Like, how would you describe meaning and how that fits in with strategy? Like, what do leaders need to be thinking about to extract the meaning and really communicate the meaning to their people?
I think if I start with what we know from the science on the study of meaning and purpose, and there's been, prolific increase of publications in the last 20 years. When I first started studying positive psychology, there was not very much at all. And so now there's quite a lot. So they do tend to differentiate meaning and purpose, even though those words or terms are used interchangeably a lot of the time. So meaning tends to refer to finding meaning in life, not necessarily the meaning of life. So it's about knowing what matters most, and this is where it connects beautifully to knowing our core values, what's important to us personally. And of course, a lot of organizations, as you know, are very explicit in identifying their values, the organizational values. So if we come back again, meaning in life, so knowing what matters most and then trying to create a values congruent life. So on a day-to-day basis, are you really living those values? Now, in the work I do with my own coachees, I get them to do a values reflection and I give them a list of words. It's not exhaustive. I say to them, you can, choose your own words and values, but I ask them to identify top 5 personal values and top 5 work values, because sometimes the work ones are a little bit different. Sometimes there's an overlap. But I usually find not a lot of people have given much thought to their own personal values and how the work, their role or the organisation gives them an opportunity to really live those values. So at an individual level, there's a real opportunity for people to really reflect, and we call it crystallizing your core values. And I'm happy to make available that worksheet that we use if that's helpful. And then it's also looking at priorities, because sometimes depending on our season of our life, some of those values might have a change in priority, what's more important at a certain point in time. So then if we come back to purpose is defined as an overarching life aim. So what is the purpose of my life, And for some people, they're really clear on that, they have a calling, but other people don't. Other people are very happy to just have that, and it's not a just, but to have meaning in life. They don't necessarily need to have an overarching life aim, if you like. So I think it's a really interesting area to talk about and have discussions. And I did a lunchtime session in one of the large global investment banks a few years ago, Tricia, on meaning and purpose. And I was talking about this research, which I will quote, by Amy Rezanewski, Professor Amy Rezanewski, on how people view their work. And there are 3 primary ways, her research says. One is it's a job. I go in, I do my work, it pays the bills, I come home. Now, the important thing there is for people with a job, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a job. We all have to survive. I've had jobs in my lifetime, but the most important thing there from a meaning perspective is that you have something outside of work, or something in your life that does give you a sense of meaning, because meaning is crucial to our mental health and well-being. So there's job, then there's a career. So these are the people that perhaps want to be the CEO. They're very career oriented. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That can give you a purpose, I guess, or goals to work towards. And then calling, and it may not be in the religious sense of a calling that some of us think of, but it's a sense of when I wake up in the morning and I think about work, am I clear on why I'm going to work? How are my values being lived at work? And it doesn't necessarily depend on the type of job. Now, I work with a lot of teachers, and overwhelmingly teachers will tell you that, it was a calling from when they were a young person. They came in to make a difference in a child's life. Now, when I was talking to the bankers and I shared the 3 ways of viewing the work, I had a few people in the audience call out and say, Suzy, it's a bank. This is a bank, but it was a really good discussion, Tricia, because some people then said, well, I came in to change the banking industry, or, I intend to do well financially and then set up a not-for-profit. Like, there were a whole range of reasons why people found the banking sector meaningful. So I think first and foremost, at this point in time, it's just a great discussion to have, and you could do this if you're a leader listening today. Could just be within your team. What do you find meaningful about work, or why did you come to work at this organization? Because I think more and more, particularly again with our younger population, they're really quizzing. Like, they're looking for great places to work. They're looking for organizations that are socially conscious, that want to make a difference in the world. And so I think we are seeing an interest in this. And I think it's Deloitte's, I hope I've got it right, that have appointed a chief purpose officer now. So I think, it's going to be increasingly important as time goes on.
I love that. Chief Purpose Officer.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was fortunate to work with an organisation here in Australia with a department of 60 people, and we introduced a whole range of positive psych, positive organisational scholarship interventions. And the one that had the biggest impact on people and on the culture is what they told me was starting their town hall, so their monthly town hall meeting, with what's working well. So, and people would take turns in sharing a win, if you like, of something that had worked really well. And that generally led to appreciation, sharing appreciation to other people in the department that helped to make that happen. So it was sort of overcoming that negativity bias, which we haven't really spoken much about, but rather than getting straight into the problems, which is how they told me their previous town halls started, they pretty much said, these are all the issues that we've got to address or talk about today, right? So they flipped it and they started with, let's start with our wins. What are the things that have worked well in the last month? And then sharing appreciation for people that made that happen. And they said that was such a powerful way to start those town halls. And then they were able to address the problem. So it's not as if you're avoiding the problems, but there's a research rationale for this too, which comes back to broaden and build theory. Because when we experience positive emotions, the research tells us we're more creative. We come up with a longer list of ideas when we're given problems to solve. So if you do have problems to solve, you want to try and get as much positivity before you get into those problems. That's what the research tells us. We're going to come up with more solutions, better decisions. There's a number of studies that underpin this.
Yes, and you just reminded me that we haven't touched on negativity bias yet. This would be a good point to kind of go into that. Could you, for listeners who are new to this concept, describe what negativity bias is, and what are some concepts in positive psychology to help deal with negativity bias?
Yeah, so the negativity bias, again, in a nutshell, is our natural tendency, or I guess inbuilt tendency, phenomena. It's a phenomena as well, but how we tend to focus on the things that aren't going well. So our brains, and again, this is, I guess, from a survival perspective, are scanning for things that could kill us or that could go wrong. Now, we're not in those environments that was really essential to our survival, back in caveman days, for example. But I mean, we still have a lot of stressors, as you know, in our lives. So we sort of scan for the things that can do us harm. Now, in saying that too, some people have I would argue, stronger negativity biases than others, or what might be referred to as a stronger pessimistic bias. So it's a great reflection point, and perhaps even for people listening now, to reflect on, do I have a strong negativity bias or do I have a strong pessimistic bias? And there are some things that we can do around that. The first thing is to be aware of it, to be mindful of it. And I guess this is what I would call a broader capability, perhaps around the skill of mindfulness, being an observer of your thoughts, not being completely fused with your thoughts, but starting to, create a bit of a gap between, that observing and watching the thoughts, and then deciding whether they're helpful or whether they're hindering you. And then, is there an alternative way to think about a situation? So that can really help, being an observer of the negativity bias, talking some sense to yourself, just letting it float off and bringing your attention back into whatever matters in this moment. So there's a whole range of what I would say are both mindfulness and mindset psychological capabilities that you can learn and apply to overcome the negativity bias. If you get some input and involve people, I think you'll find, and particularly in this day and age, people are really interested in this sort of, information, and particularly if you've got young children. So I actually presented at a corporate a few years ago, and I asked the audience, does anyone here have children at schools where they're learning some of these psychological skills? And this man said, Susie, yes. He said, we're so glad you're here, because our child that's in kindergarten, so 5-year-old, came home last week and taught my wife and I about growth mindset, right? So we've got 5-year-olds teaching adults some of these skills at the moment, Tricia. So I'm big on education. I mean, that's what we do. A large part of our work is education, psychoeducation, if you like, and then we use coaching to help people personalize that education or contextualize that, and how is that relevant to me. Just another example, I presented to, it's a global company, this is the Australian New Zealand team that I am working with. There's 130 staff, and I've done a whole day on wellbeing with them, and then we went back and I did a half a day on resilience and mental toughness. Now, we have created some toolkits which they're going to sort of work with their internal design team, and they're going to look at some of the common scenarios that people come up against in the workplace where it can be challenging, and then a bit of a playbook, if you like, or a guidebook on which are some of the psychological strategies that might be helpful here.
I particularly love the example about, the 5-year-old teaching the parents about growth mindset. It shows you how relevant it is at all stages of life, not just now, but just as you're growing and you're learning, just keeping that same sort of mentality of, checking yourself. Do I have the right mind frame? Am I sort of leading my life the right way? And I think that's really important, like the education piece.
I do. And I think, as you know, organisations, and in many ways, thanks to COVID, are becoming more humanised. And I'm loving that word at the moment. They're becoming more, because we saw people in their home environments, and people are spending more time working from home, and there's a greater focus on mental health and well-being. So I really see workplaces as key institutions in our society that have the potential to improve people's lives for the better. And yes, there's going to be a performance effect. We know there's so much research to show that when people are flourishing, they're performing, they're more productive, they're more engaged. So we know that, but it's the right and noble thing to do, I would think, Tricia.
Absolutely. And I love that as an ending point. The fact that, all the things that you've talked about is not just for a particular company's benefit to help their people be better at what they do and be more productive, but also just to help like society in general and just to thrive better, not just in their work lives, but then consequently, hopefully in their personal lives as well.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. That's our hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Lattes with Leaders. We've really learned a lot about positive psychology, about coaching, about creating meaning in workplaces. I think it's going to be a really helpful conversation, especially for leaders who are trying to change their workplace or introduce new ways of working to really help their people grow and flourish. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on here, Tricia, and for doing the wonderful work that both you and Zena are doing.
Don't forget to check out our more recent episodes where we connect with global female CEOs to explore how to make it to the top. Whether your ambition is to be an executive at a corporate, build a franchise, or pivot your traditional career, check us out. Be sure to give us a like or follow on LinkedIn, TikTok, or Instagram at Lattes with Leaders. Our mission is to hear the voices of women from around the world. So if you're an avid listener and want your voice heard through our platform, please reach out.